Hey everyone, good morning, good evening. We are in, as far as I know so far, in two coasts of the United States. I am up here in California, as you can see from my t-shirt. That's the only topical thing I could find. And Mick LaSalle, Mick is at the bottom of the screen in my orientation. Mick is in New York, where it's pretty cold, so you can probably see that also from what Mick's wearing. Mick is actually from California. He is the longtime movie critic at the SF Chronicle, and one of the things that when I first moved here 23 years ago, and the first time I read Mick's column back in the Chron, and he has this very unique review rating system. It's a little bit like Roger Ebert had the thumbs up and Ebert and Siskel. And Mick has this person who is applauding, and you can see him like, if it's a really good movie, he like almost falls off the couch where he is watching the movie from. And then there's the other one where I think he just is very disinterested and he's like almost falling asleep. So the movies that you're going to be talking about, I think, will be more on the jumping off the couch and so excited and applauding, that variety. And I also wanted to share some of the writings. I think I shared some of these over the group. Mick has a couple of books you can, I don't know if you can see. Okay, let me just get it closer. These are only two of the books that Mick has written. The one here, which is on The Beauty of the Real, what Hollywood can learn from contemporary French actresses. And then this one, Dream State, and I think it's getting reversed on the screen probably. Dream State is California in the movies. California is one of the most beautiful places for movies. In fact, this particular scene is almost the same one. This is the Golden Gate Bridge on my t-shirt. It's almost the same one as you see in Vertigo, almost from the same angle. And then with me also is Jai Arjun Singh. Jai and I are longtime friends, started as people that we'd met each other online in the good old days of blogging. And then, of course, we got together in real life after that, as they say. And I think Jai has written quite a few books. And the one probably which a lot of us here know of is the book on this Indian cult Indian film, Jay. I guess that's what I would call it.
Yeah, it's generally called a cult comedy. Yeah.
Yeah, a cult comedy. And which year was that, Jay? Jani Vido Yaro?
It was 1983. It turned 40 just a few months ago.
Yep. And then after that, I think, Jay, this is your latest one on the Indian director Hrishikesh Mukherjee. Again, what is known as middle cinema, which is mostly comedic. Again, Jay, probably I think it would be easy to say they're mostly comedic, mostly. And I'll say there's Indian movies of that era, probably a lot of social comedy too, if that's the word.
Yeah, it's a combination of both things. The accent is towards a slightly lighter comic tone, but it essentially deals with the Indian middle class as it was defined back then in the 1960s, 70s, 80s when he was working, and how that was different from the more extreme forms of Indian cinema. At one end, the most mainstream over the top idiom, and on the other hand, the self-consciously artistic, grounded, realistic film. So it sort of occupied a middle ground between those two.
And then, of course, which unfortunately has gone out of print now, but edited a book of film-related essays, which I think we're discussing in our film group very recently. Now, the book here that I really wanted to cover in this session is by Mick, and it's called Complicated Women. And sadly, my order has not come through. I decided I shall not do Amazon, and I'll order it from a local independent bookstore. And who told me that we have a go down in the East Coast, lots of paperbacks, it'll come in a week. And that was 2 weeks ago. So I have been trying to read as much of it online as I can. But I am absolutely delighted to have this opportunity to have both of you here. Mick runs a very, and I actually first met Mick in summer. He is doing a live class with real people in a room, not used to those anymore, at Stanford on Cary Grant. And that's how I first met Mick. Of course, I'd heard of him before. And then I talked to him. I said, Mick, hey, I have this friend of mine, which is Jay, and it'll be really great to get both of you together. So we are here now, finally. And we're thinking of what to talk about. And Mick's Complicated Women actually gives a really good topic of pre-code movies, which is what we are here today to talk about. Starting with pre-code and then making our way probably to something a little bit more over the years and a little bit more recent. So, Mick, I'll start with you. And let's define pre-code, because in California, the only code people talk about is programming code. So,
okay. Pre-code era is the 5-year period from the beginning of talkies becoming widespread, which is around 1929, up to July 1st, 1934, when a rigid production code was enforced. It's a production code, basically a censorship code, that was enforced on July 1st, 1934. The code itself was written in February of 1930, but it was promptly ignored. Nobody paid attention to it. And so you have about a 5-year period where movies were essentially uncensored. The only thing that held back filmmakers was concern of whether the audience wouldn't like it. Whereas after the code, or during the code, the movies, the code was there not to protect audiences from what it didn't want, but from what it actually wanted to see. So and when you get familiar with the code, it becomes almost instantly obvious, if you're watching a movie from 1934, whether the movie was made in the beginning of the year or the end of the year. The one difference, sometimes around June or July, around maybe July or August, there might be some ambiguity because things are in the pipeline. But generally speaking, once you get to a little bit later in the year, it's profoundly obvious. You just know that it was not made pre-code, because it's such an abrupt difference. Anyway, so that's what the code is, in pre-code is.
And this is a time when obviously the film industry in India or in UK or some of the other countries in Europe, Japan, it's all, I don't know if it is flourishing is the right word, Italy, it is going on in some form or the other.
Yeah,
and
sure.
Do you see something like this? Is this a very American Hollywood phenomenon?
Yeah, no, it's an American thing. I'm not sure what the British had. I know that I don't know what India had. I do know that that they had nothing like that in other parts of Europe. So what happened in the United States was, I think, I wouldn't necessarily say unique, but to my knowledge, it might be actually unique. And it really, it just creates a very abrupt break in the free expression of cinema. I mean, what the nice thing about when you watch a pre-code movie, it's not, it's not that it's not that you get to see things that you don't see or hear things that you don't hear, but you get to, the privilege of pre-code cinema is that you're hearing an era, a period of time, from a long time ago now, it's 90 years, speaking with its true voice. So you have a generation or an era just speaking honestly to you about how they feel about life, and it's a pure communication. When you introduce censorship, you corrupt that, and so you don't really know. Like, you watch a movie from 1945 and you see social, sexual, political attitudes, and you don't know, well, is that really what they felt or what they felt like they had to say? But if you see a movie from 1932 and they're saying it, you know that that's how people felt, because movies are designed to please everybody, right? They're designed to please everybody. If 51% of the audience isn't even enough. So when you express a sentiment, an idea in a movie, especially in an era when there was no niche markets, there was no There was no rating system allowing certain people in and certain people not in. These movies were designed to please absolutely everybody. So if somebody says something, they either are saying something that they think will please everybody, or that actually will please everybody. In other words, they could be wrong, but generally you're hearing the true voice of the time, and that is a privilege. I mean, you think 90 years ago, 90 years before that would be like 1844 or 1842. To hear people from 1842 talking about how they feel about things. The other thing, just to say really quickly, is that the things that get preserved in these movies very often are things that are never expressed, because like in every era, there are certain attitudes, certain ideas about life that are so accepted and so completely understood that nobody needs to say what they are. But as time goes on, of course, these change, and what those attitudes and those ideas, they become lost. And you can only infer them from action or from things people say. When you watch a movie, you know exactly how they saw themselves and how they saw life and what they thought was cool or interesting or beautiful, because it's right there in front of you. So that communication is really privileged and precious, and to have it interrupted by censorship is really bad. It's just a bad thing that happened to the movies in the United States.
And I guess one way of seeing some of that play out is how these older movies get remade. So I can think of, say, Waterloo Bridge, or Jay, your favorite Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Jay is a big Frederick March fan. And even Maltese Falcon got remade. It's almost like how some of the silent films will get remade as talkies. It's almost like the pre-code films get remade and the old one gets somehow lost.
Yeah. I mean, fortunately, the Maltese Falcon, the remake is the one that we know, which is the Humphrey Bogart one, which is actually a good movie. But the original was pretty good too. The one in the middle is no good. There's actually three versions.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, but the original one was much more pre-code. But Waterloo Bridge is the real problem. That's the real shame, because Waterloo Bridge is a wonderful movie by an actress named Mae Clarke, and Mae Clarke is only famous now for getting hit in the face by a grapefruit from James Cagney in The Public Enemy. But Mae Clarke was wonderful in this movie, Waterloo Bridge. But fortunately, and she plays a prostitute, and it's very it's a very touching film, because this girl is stranded there and she has no money. She has to become a prostitute, and then things happen from there. Anyway, that movie was made in 1931, so it's pre-code. It was remade in 1940 with Vivien Leigh, where she's a ballet dancer. The movie doesn't make any sense at all, but it's not terrible, but it's not particularly good. But when MGM bought Waterloo Bridge, they also bought at least part of the rights of the 1931 movie, so that they could suppress it, so that it can never get released. It couldn't have gotten released during the code anyway, but they suppressed it. And then what happened is that the legal tangle was it wasn't clear really who owned the movie. It was like Universal still owned a piece of it and MGM owned a piece of it. So as a result, the movie was never seen until briefly in like 1996. They let it out. We showed it in San Francisco at the Roxy, and then it went underground again for about another 7 or 8 years, until somebody at Warner Brothers, they paid some lawyers to work it out. The problem was that the lawyers cost more than they could ever hope to make from the movie, because it was going to cost $100,000 to liberate the movie, and the movie would never make that much. But anyway, that is a wonderful movie that was completely just suppressed, and as a result, nobody knows Mae Clarke's career, which is sad, because that's her great movie.
I think that's a good segue for us to talk about some of the other actresses of that era. And when the big silent to talkies transition happened, and actually our recent film Babylon has some great parts about that. It obviously killed some careers. And I think in your other book, Dangerous Men, Mick also has a book on complicated women of the actresses of the pre-code era. Mick also has a book, Dangerous Men, about some of the actors of that time. someone like John Gilbert gets pretty much that's the end of the road for him. And of course, there are other people like that. But do you feel that from pre-code to code, and pre-code is such an actress-heavy era, really?
It really is, yeah.
And you talk about Mae Clark. Mae Clark does not get that kind of movie roles anymore, except like the Public Enemy thing. The actors do better. I guess Lee Tracy or somebody like that doesn't really get that kind of roles, but someone like Clark Gable is obviously flourishing. So is Spencer Tracy also flourishing. But in the actress side, people like Barbara Stanwyck has a incredibly productive and rich career. Double Indemnity still to come, etc. But do you think the other actresses, and I guess I should add also the successful transition era, there is Greta Garbo, but someone like a Norma Shearer, someone like maybe the Ruth Chattertons and some of the actresses there. How do you think that transition happened?
Okay, well, so during the period of the code, women were the biggest stars. If you bought a fan magazine, there was a woman on the cover. 60, I think like 61 or 63% of the movies that were made in 1933 starred a woman. For most of like the last 60 years, until just the last 5 or 6 years in the United States, the most women ever starred in a movie in, of the movies of that year would be like 20% of the films starred a woman up until 2017. Then it changed, and that's another story. I think what happened is that the women flourished in a genre that you could call romantic drama. And these were movies that were kind of, they were about courtship, basically. And so therefore they were about sex to some degree. And so because they were about sex, they were honest about it, they were of interest to everybody. When they stopped being honest because they had to be moral, they stopped being interesting. And then the women's careers kind of faded. There's a famous thing in the United States, I don't know if you've heard of it, but in 1937, which is after the code, the exhibitors of America, an organization of people who had theaters, did an article where they named certain people box office poison. In other words, if you go to the movies, and among those people named were Greta Garbo, Marlene Dietrich, Katharine Hepburn, and others.
Kate Francis.
Yeah. So why, right? So why are they box office poison? They box office poison because they could no longer make the kind of movies that people expected them to be in. Because if you're Kay Francis, who is supposed to be really sophisticated, and that's your whole thing, it's like being the sophisticated, cutting edge, daring person, and all of a sudden you have to act like, or if you're Marlene Dietrich, who suddenly has to play a nun. Marlene Dietrich is playing a nun. I mean, that's absurd, right? So of course nobody's going to want to see that. So that's why women fell off. With the men, it wasn't as bad because what the men did was instead of playing bad guys, they started playing cops. And so that then it was kind of okay. But for women, basically the kind of movies that they made, just disappeared. And what you're left with in the late 30s and 40s, you get the return of film. You get film noir, where you have a woman can be sexual, but she's evil, right? Or you have all these really sacrificial, what they call women's pictures or woman's pictures, where the woman is like just always sacrificing herself and she's really good. And then of course she's not sexual at all. So that's it. The realistic portrayals of women go. And so if you're that kind of woman, the actresses who thrive are the ones who are good in comedy, because then it became like Carole Lombard, Katharine Hepburn to some degree, later on, Claudette Colbert. These people really thrive because they were okay in screwball comedies, but the romantic dramatic women, no, not good. And even the ones who maintain their careers, like Norma Shearer, in terms of box office, did fine. When you look back in her movies, and you don't want to watch them, they're not very good. Garbo was pretty good. Garbo's later movies were good, but people didn't want to see them. But they were good. But so it varies. They either tanked from quality or from lack of interest, or both.
Now, while all this is going on in the outside world, and we just talked about this being more of an American phenomenon, in fact, the whole concept of self-censorship is a very American thing, or self-regulation, sorry, not self-censorship, self-regulation is a very American thing. And I was joking with Jay earlier that in India, we are not used to these things. We have a censor board. And I think it's also the case in the UK. And in most other countries, they have some kind of a government-appointed board. Here, of course, the industry is thinking, we better take care of it before somebody else comes in and does it for us, which
they're worried about it.
Yeah, somehow always reminds me of M and the Berlin Underground deciding to go and catch the child murderer before they get into more trouble themselves. In this case, in America, while all this is going on, outside you have the Great Depression. Prohibition is going on, though it kind of ends somewhere in that time. And so, in fact, when I was watching Divorcee yesterday, there are so many references to work. And Chester Morris, the so-called hero of the movie, loses a job. He's out of work. Things that we don't really see so much of being out of work, and except probably Jay, that Michelle Leeson movie with the coat, where there is some out of work people. Ray Milland is out of work at that point, and he decides to get away from his father's affluence. So my point is, while all this is going on outside, at that time and place, maybe some of those topics also flourish. And I can see for a local audience why something like what they're seeing, whether it's a musical or a horror movie or even the comedies, have a certain appeal. But Jay, if I can, let me just go to you here. That's not the context in which you saw these movies, or even when I saw these movies. We saw it in a very different context. And so we do not have all the historical baggage that Mick just talked about, or the general state of the industry, or what people are thinking. So if you have to go in as somebody from outside looking at these movies and watching these movies, how do you enter that world? What's your hook?
Yeah, it's very difficult to answer that question because, of course, like you mentioned, that I think we had similar journeys growing up in India, and just at some point, for some combination of strange reasons, becoming obsessively interested in old Hollywood, including films that were made decades before we were born, even. And of course, you know how difficult it was in the late 80s and the early 90s, being in India, to even get access to many of these films. And I'm talking about a time when satellite TV is only just about coming into India for the first time, and then of course you have some film channels that start showing these things. Otherwise, we're going to embassy libraries or video cassette parlors and stuff like that. One thing that I just wanted to say, I've been reading Mick's book, Complicated Women, with great interest, and it would be great if at some point he could just uh, talk a little more about some of the things that are covered in the book, about what makes those screen women of 1929 to 1934 more complicated, uh, more alive, greater vitality than many of the women who came in the next couple of decades in Hollywood. So speaking for myself, one thing I will say is that uh, uh, I just have these vivid memories of watching some of those early 1930s films and crushing on women like Miriam Hopkins and Myrna Loy and Carol Lombard. Uh, Even before I could really articulate anything about the kinds of characters they had played on screen, or why it was so stimulating to watch them at this remove of 60 years. And reading Mick's book helped me articulate some of those things, because uh, I remember, watching films like Blonde Venus, the Marlene Dietrich in that. Uh, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, you mentioned Frederick, my being a Frederick March fan, but really, Miriam Hopkins is such a powerful, sensual presence in that film. It's incredible, and I think I definitely recognize that as an adolescent, and in Trouble in Paradise as well, Night Nurse with Barbara Stanwyck, a few others. Uh, but what Mick's book did for me was also to suddenly, uh, be able to see someone like Norma Shearer through completely new eyes. Because, like many other people, including many Americans in the intervening decades, her stock had fallen, right? I think what happened was that when she became known in later decades, mainly for the work that she did in the Code era films, like Romeo and Juliet or Marie Antoinette or The Women, that was not Shearer at her most alive or at her most powerful as an actress or as a screen presence. And that's something that Complicated Women, the book, really opened my eyes to and made me, really want to go and watch some of those films. Watch the early Joan Crawford again. Watch some of the early Garbo films. So it'll be great if before we really get into other things, if Mick could just tell us a little bit about why, say, Norma Shearer, 1929 to 1934, was so different and so much more interesting
Yes.
than the Norma Shearer of the code era. If you could just tell us something about it.
Okay, so how this gets to how the book even just came about. What happened is that I was in a weird category. I was in a weird category because I was extremely familiar with pre-code movies. I liked them a lot, and whenever I'd want to, whenever I'd see a pre-code movie that was available, I would tape it to watch it, on VHS. However, I didn't know Norma Shearer at all, except for The Women, because when she died in 1983, I read one of her obituaries, which was a wire obituary that was printed in a lot of different places, saying that she was a really bad actress and everything wrong. It was all wrong information, but it was it was useful because I um, I I became kind of a vague expert in pre-code in the way that a fan does, not like, not in a scholarly way. So that when I eventually saw a Shearer movie, I was able to put it into context. So, um, so what happened is that I was watching a movie, That's Entertainment, and there was a clip of Norma Shearer in 1931 giving an award to somebody, and I thought, wow, she's really pretty. She doesn't look the way she does even, in The Women. She really looks nice. Maybe I should see one of her movies because I like this period. And so maybe a few months went by and I was in a video store and I decided to get The Women and Private Lives. I had a friend, I was a friend who had a cat and I had to go feed this cat. And the cat was very needy and he was alone the whole day, 24 hours. So I decided that I was going to go home and watch this movie. I figured I'd watch the movie there so that I'd keep the cat company. And so the cat got on top of me and I watched The Divorcee for the first time. The Divorcee has a moment where she finds out that her husband has cheated on her, and so she's very confused by this. He goes away on that night on a business trip, and she goes out that night and has sex with his best friend, and then he comes home. And I'm watching this scene, and finally she's about to tell him what happened, and she says to him, "I've balanced our accounts," is what she says. And he said, and he says, yeah, and says, "I'm sorry," and everything. Anyway, when she said, "I've balanced our accounts," I almost fell off the couch because I had a frame of reference for understanding that that was about the most pre-code thing I'd ever seen in a movie. Now, there are other things that are very pre-code too, that, that are equal to that, but that's a very pre-code moment. And I thought, wow, Norma Shearer. So then I watched Private Lives. And I thought, well, this is not what I thought, right? So, and so then I saw a couple of other movies, and I realized that, hold on a second, she was really on the cutting edge of what was going on. So I went to the library, which is what people used to do before the internet, is go to libraries. I went to the library to read a book about how Norma Shearer was on the cutting edge of everything. Nothing. In fact, disinformation. Everybody just said, they repeated they basically just, they saw The Women, they saw Romeo and Juliet and they made up. They just did not, they just guessed about the other ones, because in those days, before video, you could write anything in a book because nobody could check it, because nobody had access to the movies. And so they, you know, they'd look at a plot summary, whatever, and they would just make up something. And so I thought, wow, well, let me just see if I'm right. So I went to Stanford on my 35th birthday. I went to Stanford and I started, because they had a whole bunch of varieties. And so I just started reading Variety. And I realized that in 1930, 31, 32, 33, Norma Shearer was considered one of the most pre-code of the pre-code women, and that nobody knew it. And so then I just became obsessed, and I wanted to write a book about Shearer. Couldn't get that published. Then I wanted to write a book about Shearer and Garbo. Couldn't get that published. So then I decided to do a book about all the women of pre-code, but have it concentrate on Shearer and Garbo, and that got published. And that was Complicated Women. Now today, when I read Complicated Women, I read, you know, it was like so much. It took me 5 years. I got rejected. That Complicated Women got you know, in all its versions, got rejected for 4.5 years. And you know, with rejections, you don't build. If you stop, it just ends. You know what I mean? It's not like you're making progress towards publication. You either get published or you don't. And so I didn't know when it ever would happen. But by the time it got published, I was so fierce about this, you know, I was on such a missionary quest about this, that when I read it today, I sometimes sound like a fanatic. Like when I read Complicated Women now, I say I sound like I'm a complete Norma Shearer psycho. But I wanted to redress this imbalance. And I think as a result that it has been redressed, because when I read about Norma Shearer now, I'm reading people quoting me without knowing it, because they're basically saying things that I said, but they're taking it from somebody who said it after I said it, or somebody else. But that's what we do when you write a book. I mean, you were writing a book hoping that the ideas get into the air. And if you don't worry about the fact that and you get it, it's attributed to you, you can really enjoy it. And I am enjoying it because it made a difference. I was able to change the perception of her. And just to answer, the difference between Norma Shearer in the pre-codes and Norma Shearer in the post-codes, in the pre-codes, she's sexy, she's independent, she is vital. In the post-codes, she's kind of milquetoast. She, you know, and I told you what happened in the divorce where she has sex with the guy's best friend, because, you know, in the women, basically she gets cheated on and just mopes for the whole movie until the last 30 seconds of the movie. So it's a different woman. Norma Shearer wanted to be on the cutting edge. She made it her mission to make those kinds of movies that she made, but then those kinds of movies disappeared. And the whole point of a Norma Shearer movie just went away. So anyway, that's the answer.
Yeah, but you also have some fascinating backstories about, you know, as you mentioned, she made it a mission for herself, so that included doing certain things to convince her husband, Irvin Thalberg, the
Yeah.
producer, that she could play a role like this. You know, just going for that
Yeah.
was it a surreptitious photo shoot where she presents herself in a very sexy, sensuous way, and he looks at the photo and says, wow, you know, she can play this part.
Yeah.
Was that for the divorcee? I think that was for the divorcee.
That was for the divorcee, yeah. And the photographer was George Harrell, who was a nobody then. But after those pictures, he got hired by MGM and became, you know, the most important portrait photographer in Hollywood history. But he was an unknown guy at that point. He was in his 20s. But yeah, she took a bunch of pictures and he said, okay, you can't play this role. And that's what happened. Joan Crawford wanted that role. She would have been terrible in it. I think she would have been exactly wrong.
I think, yeah.
We have a few questions. I'll just get to that. And I think, let me just frame these questions as, of course, like it or not, the code came in, the production code came in. And and just to I have one picture here of the production code or what exactly it felt like. So just give me one moment. It was quite funny actually. And of course I can't find the picture now, but never mind. So never mind. Let me get back to the questions being asked. The production code moves on. People follow that, and new genres are born. There is screwball comedy. Pretty much comes in at that time. A couple of months back at Berkeley at the PFA, I was listening to Stuart Fallons, who's got this new book out on Preston Sturges, and he says that the Preston Sturges era, the screwball era, pretty much starts as the code ends, and you could say a lot of the code things ends up becoming screwball. They just disguise it, which is, of course, movies are all about disguise, and that's the other meaning of code, is just that you're putting it in code, whether it's gay code or whole Cirque movies or any kind of hidden meaning, subtext that you're not going to read at the beginning because that's what you do, you hide in plain sight. Do you feel that the pre-code sentiment and that thinking of films in this manner, did that end up going in other directions? Did it end up going in noir? Did it end up going in exploitation pictures, etc.?
Sure. Okay, well, okay, so the thing is, because I just checked this, Screwball overlaps with pre-code by a few months. Like 20th Century is from May of 1934. I'm not sure when Happened One Night is, but I think it might be March of 1934. And the thing is that when the code came in, it was very abrupt. It wasn't like it was gradual. The most pre-code daring movies were made like 2 months, were released like 2 months before the code came in. So it's not like they were working up to it. But it does seem quite likely that the proliferation and popularity of screwball comedy was in some way related to the coming of the code. And the theory that Andrew Sarris had, who's a film critic, used to write for the Village Voice, but then wrote a bunch of books too. Andrew Sarris said that it's basically sexual energy that has to go somewhere. And so it goes into this kind of erratic kind of screwball thing. And then also too, if it's screwball, it's not obligated to be completely realistic. And so if it's not completely realistic, nobody's going to notice that the people in the movie are acting weird. They're not behaving like normal human beings because nobody is, because it's a screwball atmosphere. So I think, yeah, I think screwball did. Noir, I think is, I think of noir as a reaction to the code in the sense that you want to have women be overtly sexual, but you can't do that unless they're evil. So, okay, well then we'll just have a bunch of evil women. If you look at the codes of like the noirs of France, which are, by the way, just as good, at least as good as the American noirs. And in fact, they may have invented noir with poetic realism, which is not called noir, in the late 30s. But if you look at the French noirs, they don't have as many evil women the way we have. In American noir, not every single one, but I mean, I think the majority of film noir has some woman in it who's evil. And I think it's because it's the only way to have them be really sexy. You can't kill off, you know, if Kay Francis is kind of sexual in a romantic comedy, you can't kill her at the end of the movie. But if you devise a genre like noir, where she gets to be evil, and then you can kill her at the end of the movie. And actually, she's killed in Allotment Wives. That's a pretty good noir, Kay Francis. But anyway, so yeah, it definitely has an effect, you know, from there on. It may even have an effect on people's behavior, human beings' behavior, but it definitely had an effect on the movies for sure.
Yeah, when I was watching the Frederick March, Miriam Hopkins version of Jekyll and Hyde, the whole experiment that Dr. Jekyll is doing is how to isolate the bad parts of yourself from the good parts, and which is, I think, what ends up happening. And noir is that distillation of all the bad parts of yourself, and as the way that the female roles now start getting written, and in a way also,
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, see that I write about that in Dangerous Men. I have like a whole chapter on Frederick March. It just tells you the difference between 1921 and 1931, because in 1921 they took the story of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and they made the point of the story be, this is what happens if you don't control yourself, right? 1931, the problem is, this is what happens if you try to control yourself. If you basically try, if you try to control, if you deny people sex, this is what happens. I mean, basically, he cracks up because he wants to marry his girlfriend. The father won't let him marry, and so he's like charged up with all this energy, and then he goes completely on a rampage. I'm interested what Jay has to say about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, because I think that's a great Frederick March movie, and it's also it's like one of 4 movies from the pre-code period in which Frederick March says the words "I'm in hell." He's really like the pre-code star who expresses like real like existential pain in the pre-code era. It's really fascinating. But yeah, but have you written about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, or?
Well, not in these, not really in these terms, but I'm very curious. Which are those other films in which he says,
I'm in
"I'm
hell."
in hell"? Yeah.
Okay, so he says it in Smiling. He says Smiling Through. He says, "Can't you see I'm a man in hell?" I don't know the other 2, but I'll get it to you because it's in my book. But yeah, he's in hell a lot.
I could have sworn he said that in the Iceman comic. The last
He probably just kept on saying it.
No, but this is pretty interesting because again, as we know, we're talking about women here being shunted into more moral, respectable roles. But Frederick March, given that he was quite a versatile actor and did many things later, he did seem to later in his career he did seem to have a respectability about him that you wouldn't really find in 1930, 1931. In 1931, he has that great hammy performance as a John Barrymore type in the Royal Family of Broadway, which is just something where he just lets himself go completely in a way that you probably wouldn't see later. So I don't know, maybe that's one example of a male star who was somewhat constrained by the coming of the code. I don't know if just
Well,
an
no, I
idea.
think it's very possible. He was very good with women in the pre-code period. He just was a little bit different with women than some of these other stars. You see him in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, what he's like. He's very vulnerable and he's manly, but he's very vulnerable. As far as him with women are concerned, of course, he was getting a little bit older, but he wasn't that old. When the code came in, he was like maybe 37, so that's still pretty young. But he made Anna Karenina with Greta Garbo. And that was ridiculous because if you read the production code file on that, and this is made after the code, the head of the production code is telling MGM, you can't have them kissing. You can't have them, and it was, I think it was David Selznick wrote back. He said, well, I'm hard pressed to figure out how I'm supposed to make Anna Karenina without these people kissing. But if you look at the love scenes, I think they do kiss here and there, but it's so wooden because it just doesn't feel right. And if it were, made if it were made pre-code, it would have been different. Because Frederick March just looks stupid in the movie. He just looks like he's fumbling around. He wouldn't look that way if it were made in 1932. He would just have much more command, and he would look like, it's hard to be it's hard to look good in a romance when it looks like the person you're playing opposite doesn't like you. You know what I mean? And it's like she won't touch him, and so he looks like he's being frozen out, and so he looks different. He looks ridiculous.
Yeah.
As much as Norma Shearer in Romeo and Juliet, I guess.
Yeah, but that was her fault because she wanted to be in that. That was
true.
Norma's fault. I don't know what she was thinking. Yeah.
I think Tathagat had a question which takes us to a slightly later era, and maybe something a bit different. But do you want to touch on that, Tipu?
Yeah. So obviously the code exists, and at some point we go beyond that. Jack
Yeah.
Valenti comes in, Jack Valenti is again, for people outside of the US, is what we would call a political operator, which is a little bit of what Will Hayes also was for Harding, Warren Harding at that
That's
era. So he is in the Lyndon Johnson, who became the president after Kennedy's assassination, and he figures out that we need to. The code is probably outdated, which is around the time also that someone like Hitchcock is pushing the envelope with his with Psycho. And I think the question that we have here is on that from Lata, and the question is on Vertigo, and he's referring specifically to Vertigo and Psycho, and how did Hitchcock manage to get away from it? And if I might broaden the question, how did the code, in the way that it was being enforced, how did it end? And what did you have after that?
Okay, well, it ends officially in December of 1968, and they bring in a rating system, which immediately revolutionizes movies, because suddenly you could show anything. You just have to make sure you have the right audience that you're showing it to. The code started losing some of its force, some of it, very little, but some of it in the 50s, because there was a sudden interest in foreign film, because foreign film wasn't censored. That's why it was so interesting to people. It wasn't censored. So foreign film starts changing people's, there's a desire in the cities, at least, for foreign films. And also a few movies, and really talking about 2 or 3 movies, start getting released outside the code. They start saying, well, that's all right, we'll pay a fine, whatever it is, and we'll release it. But still, in a mainstream movie, like for example, Breakfast at Tiffany's, right? That's 1961. That's 8 years before the end of the code. I saw that movie 5 times before I realized that Audrey Hepburn was a prostitute. It was a call girl. And I wouldn't be surprised if I'm informing somebody who's hearing this now. She's a call girl in the movie. I didn't know it. I didn't figure it out. But there's something about her getting $50 every time she goes to the ladies' room or something. And that's because in those days, they used to have somebody there. You have to tip. They hand you a towel. You give them some money. And so the way a prostitute would get paid, or a call girl would get paid, is she'd say to the guy, I need some money for the ladies' room. And the guy would give her $50. Which was a lot of money in those days. So you give her $50 instead of giving her a quarter or whatever. So you just have to tip the person. So the code was still strong then. There were some cracks in the mid-60s, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf and some other things. But it's not until December of 1968 that it completely goes. Also, too, yeah, right. And then it completely goes then. And then there's a flood. It's just an absolute flood. And also there's a flood of movies that were made outside the United States that have a lot of nudity in it, like I Am Curious Yellow, which is a terrible movie, absolutely horrible movie, but everybody's naked in it. That movie comes out it's released in the United States in late 68 or early 69, and then it's just an explosion. But it doesn't reset the clock back to 1934, because what happened is, because our movies weren't allowed to just progress naturally, what we had in the code, we had sex and romance. Before the code. During the code, we had romance but no sex. And then after the code, we have sex without romance. And it's a bad era for women in movies, but there's a lot of nudity, and it's all female, of course. So it ushers in a really good era for cinema, but it's not the era that we would have had if it progressed naturally, because it's very, very male dominated, and so it's something is missing, and it takes a while. I think now it's getting better for women in American movies, but I think it's taken 50 years it took about 50 years after the end of the code for things to begin to become kind of normal. Starting in 2018, it started getting normal, but until then.
I think Mick, another interesting point you made in the book, which relates to what you're saying here, is that there was this period, even after 1968, when a lot of when the American cinema just wasn't doing or just didn't seem genuinely interested in romance,
Right.
or presenting women in a romantic way. I think one exception you point out is perhaps Jill Clayburgh in an unmarried woman, which
Yeah.
is an interesting exception. But in general, that wasn't the case, and this could be because I think, as you say, for a couple of generations during the code years, those 3 decades, people had just been presented with such an anodyne representation of romance. So it almost became this really boring thing, and
Yeah. Yeah. And so
yeah,
it seemed phony. People would see romance as being phony. And
yeah,
so then there was no romance. So then so then it was, they just compensated by having sex without romance instead of sex and romance. Whereas if you watch a French movie, any French movie for the last 50 years, that's about, men and women getting together, it's very romantic, and it's also sexual at the same time, because they never had that divorce between sex and romance. So
Um, so we have about 6 minutes left. So let me go over a couple of other themes. One is, you're both film writers, and I know we have at least one other film writer in there. Uday has asked a question. Um, uh, I actually even have Uday's book here with me. So we have, do you think as film writers and make you have a regular film column. Jai,
yeah.
you don't quite do the regular film thing, though I know Uday does that. In these cases, as you see these happening, the whole concept of censorship and what kind of message films are giving out in these very polarized times, especially in these very polarized times, it becomes a big deal. People do feel that as critics, you are guiding taste in a certain way, but maybe people are just watching the movies based on online reviews, based on whatever they're reading, hearing from their friends. What do you think is the role of a film writer or a film critic in these times about some of the messages that you see in movies? Is that something that you get involved in the message, or for you, is it just the medium and the form?
I get involved in the message if the message that the movie is actually transmitting is different from the message that people are saying that the message is being transmitted. For example, right now there's a movie called Poor Things, which is being marketed as a feminist film. It is the most retrograde, anti-feminist, anti-woman film ever. And I don't know why it requires me to say it, because everybody's lining up praising this movie. It's like 93% on Rotten Tomatoes. And it is, it's not about female empowerment. It's not about that. So anyway, so in that case, I have to say something. I mean, if they're saying that the reason why this movie is good is because it's a great feminist film, then I have to say, well, then it's not that great a film, because it's not really a feminist film at all. It's dicey because you don't want to get too much into the messages. I mean, Triumph of the Will by Leni Riefenstahl is actually a good movie, right? It's a really good propaganda movie for Hitler, right? So you have to say it's a good movie, but it's about Hitler. But at least Leni Riefenstahl movie is admitting that it's about Hitler, right? So you could say, this is a good movie about Hitler. Don't agree with it, but it's a good movie about Hitler. Whereas if she was saying this is a movie about peace on earth and fellowship among people, and then you say, well, wow, she really blew it, because that's not how this thing is working, right? So that's where the message gets in there. But you got to be careful, because a lot of times, especially, and this is like liberal left-wing critics are particularly guilty of this, is that they will basically review things and say that they're good or not based on to what extent the movie comports with their own worldview. Now, implicit in that is a ridiculous assumption that art is good to the extent that it reflects the value of this one critic in the world, right? And if it doesn't, then and also it also reflects another ridiculous idea that the role of the critic is not to say whether something's good or not and why, but it's to advance the coming the coming millennium of everything being wonderful as soon as everybody agrees with me about everything. So this to me is nuts. So you got to be real careful about this message stuff, but sometimes it just is inevitable and you have to say it. And I think in the era of Trump, you know, I think it becomes a little bit more necessary, because I think that we're in the United States, we're in a potential serious crisis. Like we may be a year away from like a real crisis. Fingers crossed that doesn't happen, but it's possible. So it may be like all hands on deck for everybody.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think the Mick made some very important points there, many of which are surprisingly relevant to the situation in India as well, and a lot of the more ideological discourses that happen around cinema or culture, for that matter, literature as well. And you know what you said about a lot of people just wanting art or cinema or whatever you want to call it to be affirmative and to present this ideal world that everybody hopes we are moving towards. I think there are obvious pitfalls in good criticism with that sort of an attitude, because you're really sort of and you are setting yourself up as this moral authority on what is correct and what isn't, and so on. We have a lot of those conversations here as well. But I'd also have to somewhat reluctantly agree a bit with what you said towards the end there about perhaps one does need to be engaging with with rights and wrongs in the Trump era, or in whatever era India is going through currently. So yeah, these are complicated questions, and I think there are no easy answers to any of them. And I know I've had lots and lots of fights with liberal critics, with the fellow liberal critics, I should say, about their readings of films and their idealism when it comes to denouncing films because a character is not behaving in the way, a protagonist is not behaving in the way that they would like, and so on. But you can also see why, from the uh, the from the from the societal point of view, that sort of thing sometimes becomes important as well. So yeah, it's a complicated question.
Well, complicated women, complicated questions. We are almost at the end of our time. Mick, I know you are doing a session on an online session. I don't know if you want to talk about that and anything else.
Yeah, I'm doing a 10-week course on Garbo and Shearer, which dovetails in about 65-70% of it with pre-code or silent movies, and then but follows their whole career. And I don't think anybody's going to be able to take it because it's at 7 p.m. It's at 7 p.m. Pacific time, which I think is
8:30 a.m.
8:30 in the morning, your time. But if anybody wants to take it, that's who you contact. moviequail@gmail.com, and it's Kelly, and so Kelly will tell you what to do if you want to take the class. But it is at 8:30 in the morning your time, so it'll be a little rough. Although it's on tape, but then you don't get to participate if you're watching it on tape, which is not as fun.
Yeah, I know. I told a few people also who could not make it today that it's going to be recorded, but you don't get called out. You don't get to ask the question.
You don't get to meet everybody. You don't get into you don't get into those breakout rooms and everything. So it's really like having half of an experience. Yeah. I know.
And Jay, I think it's also time for you to restart some of the work that you've been doing. I know you've been lazy, and
yes, I should. There were some online courses at some point. Yes.
Yeah. I do want to thank both of you. I know it's 12:30 for you now, Mick, and it's 11 p.m. for folks in India. I really appreciated this. I learned a lot. And Mick, I will see you in January in the course on 80s cinema at Stanford.
1980s.
So,
Yeah. Well, okay. Well, thank you, everybody. It's been a privilege to be able to speak to you from so far away. And if you want to get in contact with me, you can reach me at this email address. That's Micklesal without an E @gmail.com. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Right.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
thanks.
Bye.